Many people spend their lives trying to prove their value through work. They work harder, learn more, push more, sacrifice more. The assumption is rarely stated directly, but it quietly organizes much of modern life. If enough effort is applied, enough value is created, and enough success is achieved, then eventually a sense of security will arrive. The pressure will ease, the need to prove oneself will finally disappear. Yet for many people, that moment never comes. The work may succeed, the income may increase, responsibilities may expand, others may recognize the contribution being made. And still, money remains emotionally charged. There is anxiety around receiving, discomfort around charging appropriately, pressure to keep producing, pressure to justify one's value, pressure to make everything work. Even success can feel strangely unsatisfying, as though each achievement briefly relieves something before the pressure quietly returns. What often goes unnoticed is that money itself may not be the source of this tension. The tension may come from the relationship that is formed between value and identity. Beneath concerns about income, work, pricing, and success sits a question that many people never consciously ask. Am I valuable because of what I create, or do I need to create in order to be valuable? The distinction appears subtle, yet much of our experience with work and money is organized around how that question is answered. Most people assume their struggles with money are financial. They assume the problem is income, pricing, opportunity, knowledge, strategy, and while those factors certainly matter, they are often not the deepest issue. The deeper issue is relational. Money rarely remains just money. Over time, it becomes connected to something much larger. Worthiness, identity, safety, validation, belonging. The amount received begins to feel connected to who we are rather than simply reflecting an exchange taking place within a particular moment and context. When this happens, work quietly changes its function. Work is no longer participation. Work becomes self-definition. Achievement becomes evidence, income becomes proof, recognition becomes reassurance. The nervous system begins using accomplishment to regulate insecurity. Success no longer feels like something we do. It begins to feel like something we need. This creates a subtle but important shift. Value is no longer discovered, value is performed. Instead of remaining curious about what genuinely serves, attention turns toward managing perception. How do I convince people? How do I appear more valuable? How do I gain credibility? How do I earn permission to receive? The focus moves away from contribution and toward validation. Work becomes increasingly organized around proving value rather than creating it. The difficulty is that validation can never fully stabilize the system. No amount of recognition permanently resolves uncertainty. No amount of achievement permanently secures identity. The relief is temporary because the underlying relationship remains unchanged. Beneath all of this sits a deeper distortion that is rarely questioned. The belief that effort creates value. Certainly effort can contribute to value. Effort may be required to learn, to refine, to build, to deliver. But effort alone never determines value. Many things require enormous effort and create very little value. Other things require relatively little effort and create tremendous value. The difference is not effort, the difference is response. Value emerges through relationship. It emerges through contact between what is offered and what is needed, between timing and readiness, between contribution and context, between capacity and demand. Value is not something we declare. It is something reality confirms through response. This is why value creation can never be fully determined in advance. Something must be offered. Reality must answer. Feedback must be received. Refinement must occur. What serves becomes clearer through participation, not prediction. In this sense, value is not a monologue, it is a dialogue. And the moment work returns to dialogue, much of the pressure surrounding money begins to soften. Because the responsibility is no longer to prove worth. The responsibility is simply to remain in contact long enough for value to reveal itself. When money becomes connected to identity, it becomes very difficult to see clearly. Every increase feels personal, every decrease feels personal. Every success appears to confirm something about who we are. Every setback appears to threaten it. Money is no longer experienced as information, it becomes evidence, evidence of worth, evidence of success, evidence of failure, evidence of whether we matter. But money functions far more accurately as feedback. Not perfect feedback, not complete feedback, not the only feedback that exists, but feedback nonetheless. Money reflects the relationship between value, timing, capacity, context, and response. It tells us something about the dialogue taking place between what is being offered and what reality is meeting. The difficulty is that when response is weak, most people immediately move toward one of two conclusions. The first is personal. I am not good enough. The second is strategic. I need a better method. I need more knowledge. I need a different approach. Sometimes those conclusions are accurate. Often they are not. There is frequently a third possibility that receives very little attention. The offering is still being refined. The timing is not yet mature. The value has not fully clarified. The dialogue is incomplete. Many forms of value require contact before they can become precise. What serves cannot always be known in advance. It becomes visible through interaction, through response, through refinement, through remaining in the conversation long enough for reality to answer. This is why effort alone often fails to produce the results people expect. Effort can create movement, effort can create output, but effort cannot force relevance. Reality determines relevance through response, and sometimes the most intelligent response is not more effort, it is more listening. This becomes even more important when work begins to grow. Most people assume income is limited by ambition, or confidence, or intelligence, or strategy. Yet beneath all of these sights something much more fundamental: capacity. Not potential capacity, actual capacity. The amount of responsibility a system can hold. The amount of visibility it can tolerate, the amount of complexity it can manage, the amount of receiving it can integrate without becoming destabilized. This is where many misunderstandings about success begin. People often imagine that if more money arrived, life would automatically become easier. Yet, greater income frequently arrives alongside greater responsibility. More decisions, more expectations, more complexity, more exposure. And if capacity is not expanded alongside those demands, the nervous system begins to tighten. What was once desired can begin to feel overwhelming. Opportunities become burdens, growth becomes stressful, success starts feeling heavy. Not because anything has gone wrong, but because expansion has exceeded integration. The system is attempting to hold more than it is currently organized to carry. This is why growth often produces anxiety when people expect it to produce relief. The increase itself is not the problem, the mismatch is. The nervous system responds by becoming more controlling, more vigilant, more protective, not because it is failing, because it is trying to preserve stability. What appears to be a money problem is often a capacity problem. What appears to be a motivation problem is often an integration problem. And what appears to be resistance to growth is frequently the nervous system communicating that expansion has moved ahead of what can currently be held. Seen from this perspective, reality begins to look very different. Income is no longer the primary measure. The deeper question becomes, can this be received? Can this be sustained? Can this be integrated? Because growth that exceeds capacity creates strain. But growth that remains aligned with capacity strengthens the system itself. And that changes everything about how success is understood. A different relationship with work becomes possible when value is no longer asked to carry identity. Work no longer needs to prove who we are. It no longer needs to justify our existence. It no longer needs to secure worthiness, and it no longer needs to compensate for insecurity. When these burdens begin to fall away, work returns to its natural function: participation, a living dialogue with reality. In this orientation, work is not primarily self-expression, although expression may be present. It is not survival, although it may provide support. It is not endurance in pursuit of a future reward. It is participation. Receiving becomes less threatening, giving becomes less draining. Money loses much of the emotional weight that accumulated when it was asked to define worth. As this happens, growth itself begins to look different. Most people measure growth through accumulation: more income, more clients, more visibility, more responsibility, more success. But accumulation alone tells us very little. Growth can occur externally while the system becomes increasingly strained internally. This video points toward a different measure. Not how much can I accumulate, but what can I hold without distortion? What can be received without creating overwhelm? What can be sustained without self-override? What can be expanded without sacrificing coherence? This shifts ambition from performance to development. Growth is no longer measured by what is acquired. It is measured by what can be integrated. The question is no longer whether more is possible. The question is whether more can be held cleanly. Because expansion that destabilizes the system is premature, regardless of how impressive it appears. An expansion that strengthens the system becomes sustainable. In this way, stability is no longer the reward that arrives after growth. Stability becomes the condition that allows growth to occur. And when work, money, and value creation are approached from this orientation, something begins to settle. Life no longer feels like a problem to solve. It becomes a relationship to participate in, a dialogue to remain present with, and a process through which value continues to reveal itself. Perhaps the question is not, how do I make more money? That question has guided much of modern work and ambition, but it often keeps attention fixed on outcomes while overlooking the conditions that make those outcomes sustainable. Perhaps the deeper question is, what form of value can I create that remains coherent for me to offer? Not what can be forced, not what can be maintained through pressure, not what requires constant self-override, but what can be offered honestly, consistently, and without losing contact with reality. And alongside that question is another. What level of growth can I actually integrate? Not simply achieve, integrate. What can be received without creating overwhelm? What can be expanded without creating distortion? What can be held without sacrificing stability? These questions change the relationship with work. Work becomes lighter when it no longer carries identity. Money becomes cleaner when it no longer carries worth. And value becomes clearer when it remains in dialogue with reality. Success begins to look different from this perspective. It is no longer measured primarily by accumulation. Not by how much has been acquired, not by how impressive something appears, but by coherence, by whether growth strengthens the system that receives it, by whether expansion remains stable enough to be lived. Each increase in responsibility, visibility, opportunity, or income asks the same quiet question: does this integrate? If the answer is no, more is unlikely to solve the problem. If the answer is yes, growth no longer needs to be chased. It emerges naturally from what can be held. And in that shift, money returns to its proper place. Not as proof of worth, not as a measure of identity, but as feedback within an ongoing dialogue between value, capacity, timing, and reality. A dialogue that remains alive only as long as we remain willing to listen.